Everybody, Alan Rockefeller.
All right, thank you very much. So I learned to take mushroom photos just by taking bad mushroom photos for like 20 years. So today I'm going to try to teach you everything that I wish I had known at the beginning. And start out just with composition, and that's good, really useful for everybody. And then cell phone stuff is useful for everybody. And then all of the technical stuff is at the end. And so if you don't have a fancy camera and you want to leave after we're done with the cell phone stuff, that's totally fine. So one of the most important things is the composition, how you set the mushrooms up. And what I usually like to do is have a few different mushrooms set up in different stages of development. And one thing about the brain is that mushroom photos look much better if there's an odd number of mushrooms. So 1 mushroom will look awesome, 2 mushrooms still looks awesome, but 3 looks even better, and then 4 mushrooms in a photo doesn't look right, looks kind of stupid. And then 5 mushrooms looks awesome, 6 does not look very good, 7 looks awesome. And it's not just mushroom photography, it's the same with all kinds of art, sculpture and painting and everything. Yeah. So what I like to do is find a few mushrooms that are just naturally there. These ones in the back, they're just like that. And then set up a few in front. So I just find a few like that, and then set up a few in the front. This one's cut in half, so you can see what color the inside is. Then you see what they look like when they first start out. And this one I found in Wisconsin. There's really nothing I could do to this to make it any better, because it's just a perfect cluster of mushrooms. And if I added any mushrooms or take any mushrooms away, no matter what I would do, it would be worse. So this one I just had to add a little bit of extra light. Sometimes you got to cut them open. So this one just looks like a clump of dirt until you cut it open, then it looks really cool. And it's really important to have a really sharp knife to cut them open. I like to carry little razor blades in my wallet because you can fly with them. And then also a little razor blade will cut mushrooms way better than a knife will because it's so much thinner and sharper. Generally, you want the camera pretty close to the ground. If you just have the camera right above the mushroom, it's not going to look good. And one of the most important things is to remove all the debris that's between the lens and the mushroom. So because you see in 3D, if you got pine needles or grass that are coming into the shot, then that's fine when you're looking at it. But if you're taking a picture, it just ruins the shot to have a grass going right across the mushroom. And I usually will carry like a little paintbrush because it's a lot easier to remove the dirt with a paintbrush or something than it is with Photoshop later on. But one of the most important things I've learned recently is to pay a lot of attention to what's behind the mushroom. So the background is super important. Generally, you want the background to be pretty dark. So if there's like a white leaf or some dead grass or anything that's lighting color behind the mushrooms, you should get rid of that because it looks really distracting, and you want the mushrooms to stand out and kind of be the brightest thing in the frame. And you always want full shade for all of it, for the whole photo. And so I carry this white umbrella here. Works really good. You can get 2 of these for like $15 on Amazon. But this distributes the light really well and makes sure that you have shade, and you definitely want shade behind the mushroom. So if there's sunbeams and you can see like a patch of sunlight behind the mushrooms, that's really bad. So here's one I took in the full sun in New Zealand, and I just had a couple friends stand to block the sun. But you can see I found like all these mushrooms in the background and then set up a few in the foreground, usually like large to small, just so they're kind of in order. And here's one that's super rare, that's Lepiota luteophila. It's probably the world's rarest mushroom that only grows in a spot that's about 5 feet wide and 10 feet long and nowhere else in the world. And here's a purple crust. This one I made it look cool by putting it on black velvet. And so I always carry this black velvet like this. And the black velvet is really helpful. It's super quick, but this is the kind of velvet where no matter what angle the light hits it, it generally absorbs it. If you get the kind of velvet that's made for like a dress, they're kind of shiny, and that's not what you want at all. You just want some cloth that'll absorb as much light as possible. And this is really useful for a lot of things. Like if I see a flower in the field, I'll just hold this behind the flower and then the cell phone like right here. And even with the cell phone in like 3 seconds of work, you can make this spectacular image. It is like turns it from like a normal flower picture or a normal mushroom picture into something where people are like, wow. This one here is a little tiny mycena from Texas, and it's pretty good, but I think there's too much light coming from below. If you're from Mexico, it's mycorrhizal of oak, so I put an acorn and some oak leaves there so you can see what tree this grows with, because this mushroom does not grow with pine or other places that don't have these trees. A lot of times I like something for scale and then a close-up. So here's my close-up. You can see it's definitely a bolete. But then when I add this coin, you can see that it's a super tiny bolete. But the something for scale usually kind of ruins the shot. So I usually take a quick cell phone photo with a ruler or something like that. And then for the good picture, take the scale out and just zoom in and get nice and close. And then here we got some Craterellus, and this is with a wide angle lens. And I used a wide angle lens on my camera, but this is actually a shot that works really well with cell phones too. So what I like to do a whole lot is I'll just take my cell phone, put it on the wide angle lens mode, and then flip it upside down, put it right on the ground. And the cool thing about that is you can see all of all this forest in the background, kind of puts the mushrooms into context. If it just use a macro lens, then you see the mushrooms really good, but you don't really understand where in the forest they are. And it also looks really good if you're looking up at the mushroom. So this one, I found it on the ground, but it was growing on a log. So I just lifted the log up and put it on another log. And that way you're kind of looking up at it, and it's a really good angle to see mushrooms, because usually the top of the cap is kind of boring, and it's the bottom with the gills and the stem that actually looks cool. This one also just looks like a little yellow thing from the top. So the lighting is super important, and usually what I try to do is have like 80 or 90% natural light coming from the sun, and then just add a little bit of LED light. Or sometimes it looks really good to just blast it with LED light. And so what I do is I carry a few lights, like this kind of light here. So this light is called a Ulanzi light, and it can fit onto the top of the camera. But usually what I'll do is have one on one side of the lens, one on the other side of the lens, one sitting on the camera. And then you have a whole bunch of light coming. And adding that light changes everything. Even if you're just using a cell phone, just having the phone and one of these lights in your hand at the same time makes the pictures turn out so much differently. One thing it does is when you light up the mushroom with a light that's pretty close to it, it makes the background much darker by comparison. So if you blast a mushroom with light, if it's like, even if it's the middle of the day, it'll be a really dark or even black background. But I also like reflectors, and so it can just be something as simple as a little piece of foam or a white napkin or a white t-shirt. But if you set this down in front of the mushroom, then it bounces up some of the natural sunlight up into the gills, because usually with mushrooms, the gills are in the shadow, and you need to be able to see the gills. So if you just bounce a little bit of light up onto the gills, that helps a whole lot. Doesn't matter if you're using a camera or a cell phone. And then sometimes, I have a light like this. It's like ridiculously bright, but you can like use this as a diffuser. So, or even better, something just like shine this light here, and then you can control where the light's coming from. And a lot of times it looks really cool if you put the light like behind the mushroom and then a little to the side. It kind of like lights the edges really well, and it gives it a really dramatic look. But it's a really good idea just to, kind of hold the lights in your hand and then look at your phone screen or your camera screen as you move the lights around. And the way the photo turns out changes so much, and you can just move the lights until you like how it looks and then take the picture. Here's a picture I took with natural light, and then the same picture with LED light. And you can see the background's a whole lot brighter with natural light and then a whole lot dimmer with LED light. This looks a lot more artificial and this looks more natural, but they both look cool in different ways. And then here's one I took with a sink scrubber. So it's like a stainless steel sink scrubber, and then I took one of these lights and turned it onto the blue mode. And yeah, you can see it here. So the blue light shining on the sink scrubber, and then a white light shining on the mushroom, and it gives you this cool background effect. Those cell phones are really awesome for taking pictures of large mushrooms and medium-sized mushrooms. Not so good for tiny mushrooms, but they are really good for a lot of things. If I go out and take pictures of mushrooms all day, then it's going to be like, if I'm out there in the field for 6 hours, then it's like 6 hours of computer work to get all those photos processed and online. It's a lot of work. And so with a cell phone, you don't have any of that, and that really helps. So, what I like to do is use the iNaturalist app in the field. So I find a mushroom, take a quick cell phone photo, add the iNaturalist observation right there. That way, if I never never get to the computer photos, at least there's a record of it. I have the iNaturalist number, so I can label the dried mushrooms. So like here's some matsutake, just a picture I took with my cell phone. And same matsutake with focus stacking and a mirrorless camera. And you can see that they're almost the same. There's really no difference between the two. But if you're looking at something like a tiny mushroom, here's a cell phone photo of a tiny mushroom, you can see it's not very good. Or the same thing with focus stacking in a macro lens is razor sharp. So the smaller the mushroom is, the more important it is to use a camera. But the most important thing is just where you hold the phone. Like a lot of times I'm out mushroom hunting and someone will kind of take their phone and just take a picture, and it just won't look very good, and I'll just borrow their phone for a second and hold it right where I intended the phone to be when I set the mushrooms up, and it just looks like a professional quality photo. So it makes a huge difference. But typically closer to the ground, and you can flip your phone upside down so the lenses are right there at the level of the mushrooms. That looks really good. And then sometimes, if you turn on selfie mode, if you slide it under a real tall mushroom, then you're looking up at all the branches and everything in the sky up above. That can look really cool. But the most important thing with the cell phone is the exposure compensation. You can't change the aperture. Usually don't change the ISO, but the exposure compensation is super easy to change on your phone when you're taking pictures. And usually you do need to change that. So if you have a white mushroom on a darker background, and that's usually the way it is because you got a light mushroom with dark leaves around, then this is what you do on an iPhone. But with an iPhone, if you tap on the mushroom, then this sun icon appears. If you drag that sun downwards, it makes your image darker. And if you drag it upwards, it makes your image brighter. So if you have a white mushroom with a dark background, you have to drag that sun down. And if you have a dark mushroom with a lighter background, like mushrooms on a white paper plate or a black earth tongue, then you drag that sun upwards. And when you drag that sun upwards, then you see all the different shades of black. It doesn't just look like a silhouette. But if you have a white mushroom and dark background and you don't change the exposure, then you're going to blow out the highlights and lose all the detail and all of the color on the part of the photo that's the most important, which is the bright mushroom. Here's how you do it on a camera. Just move this thing here, dark here, and blend it up. So if you want to take a picture of a tiny mushroom on a cell phone, you're pretty much screwed. But there's a few things you can do to make it better, and that is get the phone as close as possible. With an iPhone, that's usually super close, like an inch or something. And then with something like a Samsung, they use the telephoto lens for macro. So you're usually like 8 inches, 10 inches away is about the closest you can focus. Either way, you want to get the phone as close as you possibly can to the mushrooms and then just back it off a little bit until it's not blurry because it's too close. And then use the digital zoom so the image fills the screen, and that's the best that you can do. And some phones are really awesome for macro photography. You can use these lenses. They're kind of a pain though. But like this is a Samsung S24, and this one has really good macro photography. Some phones just do not really do a very good job with tiny things. So if you're going to use a fancy camera, a mirrorless, or a DSLR, then you get a couple different things. One of them is you can switch lenses. And so the one that I'm carrying on this trip, it's this Olympus. They call it OM system now. But I pretty much always use macro lenses. And so this is a OM system OM1, and it has a 90 millimeter macro lens. And so 90 millimeter lens is a pretty small angle. It's like, if I was to aim it at that chandelier, the chandelier would like fill the frame. Whereas if I had like a 15 millimeter lens, that'd be a wide angle lens. So if I was to aim it at that chandelier, I'd see all the, the whole wall and all of the different chandeliers up there. So for mushrooms, I think something like a 50 millimeter lens is best. But the focus distance of a 50 millimeter lens is real close. So if you like insects and bugs too, then you're better off with a 100 millimeter lens, because if you try to get a 50 millimeter lens like right next to a dragonfly, it's going to fly away. With a 100 millimeter lens, you can be a couple feet away and still have it fill the frame. So here's a wide angle. So that this is with a 15 millimeter. And then in the opposite end, here's a macro photography setup. So this is a macro lens here, but these are extension tubes, and this gives you more magnification. And then these are Raynox magnifying lenses. So you can take something that's just like 1 millimeter tall and make like a billboard size image with a setup like that. And then one thing that you can change on a camera is the aperture. And so when you have a lower number, it's wide open. When you have a real big number, it's like a little pinhole. So when it's wide open, you're letting a ton of light in. And when it's a little pinhole, you're not letting much light in. That changes the depth of field. And that's how much is in focus at once. So here's what the aperture looks like, opening and closing. And so it's actually inside the lens. And when I have the aperture all the way open, depth of field is really narrow. So that's cool because the background is really blurry, but there's not much in focus. If I change that, so this is like f2.8. If I make it f8, then we have a little more depth of field. And if I close it all the way to f32, we have a lot of depth of field, but you can still see it gets a little bit blurry if they're really close or really far. So what I usually like to do is focus stacking. And with focus stacking, I combine a whole bunch of images, and I open the aperture all the way. And so from here to here, it's about 30 photos combined. And then it's very blurry very quickly as I stop combining the images. That way you have as much depth of field as you want. And you also have a very blurry background. So the mushrooms stand out really well from the background. And so for focus stacking, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but I usually use this program called Helicon Focus. So here I've loaded a few images into Helicon, and if I hit render, you can watch it come together. You see, it didn't take too long, but that combined 11 images, and now all of them now is completely in focus, and you can zoom way in, and the background is super blurry.
Question. In this Helicon software free to download, or?
Helicon costs money, but it is free for 30 days. So you can download it, try it for 30 days. And then there's another one called Zareen Stacker. And Zareen Stacker is also free for 30 days. And then after 60 days, you can decide if you even like focus stacking and which one to buy. But it's not super expensive either. But here's one that I took with the aperture all the way open, and you can see the only part that's actually clear is this corner here. And then as I close the aperture all the way, now it's all very clear. But here's a few pictures that I took, and in these, I got a butterfly. The butterfly is going to be in focus in all of these, so don't pay any attention to the butterfly. Just look at how the background changes as I close the aperture. So with the aperture all the way open, the background is very blurry. The butterfly stands out really well from the background. But as I start to close the aperture, the background gets a lot more distracting as it comes into focus. And now the butterfly doesn't stand out very well at all. So a lot of times you'll want to shoot with the aperture that's pretty open to separate your subject from the background, as long as you have enough depth of field for your subjects. And you get the sharpest images around f8. Although if you open the aperture all the way, you'll never really notice the difference. And then if you close it down to like f32, you'll never notice the difference if you're like just posting on social media or something. But if you're making a billboard size image, you will see that it's actually blurrier at f22 and then even blurrier at f32. And then another thing you can change is the ISO. And the ISO is kind of like the gain on the sensor. And so different ISOs work better or worse in different situations. But if you have a ton of light, then you'll want to use a lower ISO. And if you have not very much light and you're holding the camera in your hand, then you'll get much better photos with a higher ISO. So if you're holding the camera in your hand, you'll get motion blur if your shutter speed's too low. And so if you turn up the ISO, then you can get away with a faster shutter speed and less blur. But if you're on a tripod, you'll always want the ISO to be really low because the camera can afford to sit there for a couple seconds and gather light, and then you'll get a much better quality image. Like here's one that I took at ISO 25,000, and it looks okay till you zoom in. And then you can see it's pretty grainy. But there's a bunch of computer tools now that you can use to get rid of that graininess. So here I use Photoshop to get rid of the graininess, or a program called Topaz. And they work pretty well. So you can shoot at pretty high ISO if you want to run it through these other programs to get rid of that noise. And then another option you have is whether to shoot in RAW or JPEG, and that really depends on how much you want to be able to edit the photo later. So a RAW file is huge, very large file on the disk, and you can do a lot of editing later, whereas a JPEG is a very small file and you cannot edit it very much. So when I'm shooting mushrooms, I almost always shoot in JPEG because I set the lighting up right, I set the color balance right, and then I'm using the JPEG processing in the camera, and my mushroom photos actually turn out better if I shoot it in JPEG instead of shooting in RAW. However, if I'm shooting like birds or something that's not so predictable, where I'm not controlling all of the lighting and everything like that, then I always shoot in RAW because I'm going to need to do a whole bunch of changes later, and you can't do very many changes if you shoot in JPEG. But here's an example where I shot a mushroom, and I think it was a good idea to use RAW, because this weevil looks really dim, and then this cordyceps is super bright, so you can have a lot more dynamic range, or the difference between the bright and the dark parts of the image if you're shooting in RAW. But usually a whole lot of dynamic range isn't very important, and JPEG looks better. And then the shutter speed is super important. It's just how quickly how long you have the shutter open. And if your camera's moving, that has to be not very long. And then if your camera's still, you can afford to leave the shutter open as long as it needs to be. So if you have a wide angle lens, you need to, you can get away with like 1/30th of a second handheld. Whereas if you have a like 300 millimeter lens, like for birds, you have to use a real fast shutter speed, like 1/600th of a second. So this is just like the fastest shutter, or the slowest shutter speed that you can get away with if you're holding the camera in your hand. And that's why I always carry a tripod, so I don't have to worry about this stuff. I also carry a tripod because I can keep taking the same picture over and over until it's perfect. So a lot of times I'll take a picture and then I'll notice there's a blade of grass in there, or the lighting isn't quite right, and I can just keep changing things until I like how it turned out. But when you press the shutter, it's going to shake the camera, so the delay is really good if you're on a tripod. And your images will always look better at lower ISO as long as the camera is not shaking. The camera shake is way worse than the grainy image you get from an ISO, from high ISO, because there's no way to fix camera shake. You can definitely fix the graininess from a high ISO. So what I like to do if I'm not using a tripod is use the S mode, or Canon calls it TV. That way you tell the camera the shutter speed so it doesn't go to a really low shutter speed even in the dark. And that way it keeps the shutter speed fast enough that you don't get motion blur. But if you're on a tripod or you just set the camera directly on the ground, then I like to use the A mode, or AV on Canon. So what that does is you tell the camera which aperture you want. So you tell the camera how much depth of field you want, and then it will adjust the shutter speed and just have the shutter open for as long as it needs to get that depth of field that you ask for. Here's motion blur. There's no way to fix motion blur. But this one's kind of cool. This one, I was doing an ultraviolet shot in the middle of the day, so I covered the mushrooms with black velvet, and the black velvet fell down on top of the mushroom in the middle of the shot. But with a long shutter speed, you can get these kind of cool, peaceful stream photos. This is like a 1-second exposure of a stream. You can see how peaceful it looks. This one also looks very peaceful, but then the same thing with a fast shutter speed makes it look much more exciting. And so now you're catching every little droplet there. So they're both good pictures. Some people like this one better. Some people like that one better. And the exposure compensation, almost one of the most important things, because if it's set wrong, it'll ruin the picture. But the camera is usually like this, and you go down, it's dimmer, and up, it gets brighter. But if you shoot too bright, you'll blow out the highlights, and then you lose the detail, and there's no way to get that detail back. So usually you want to shoot a little bit too dim. A lot of people will just leave the camera the day it's on all the time. And because you can always load it into Photoshop or some other photo editor later and make it brighter. And the color balance is really important if you're shooting in JPEG. If you're shooting in RAW, it doesn't matter because you can fix it later. But if you're shooting in JPEG, you cannot change the colors very much later. So like automatic white balance looks pretty good. You can see cloudy, it looks too yellow, too warm for this. And shade is even warmer. So if I was to shoot in cloudy, I could probably fix this in Photoshop and make it look all right. But if it was way too warm like shade and I was shooting in JPEG, I probably could not fix that because the blues are just gone and you can't bring them back unless you shoot raw. But like incandescent, now this makes it look terrible. It's way too, but if you were indoors under incandescent light, this white balance would look awesome and everything would look great. Same with fluorescent, same with flash. If you're actually using flash, the flash white balance is really good. And then you have picture control, and what picture control does is it controls how the JPEGs are encoded. So this is a lot of image editing stuff that usually you would do in Photoshop, but you can also just tell your camera to do it, so you don't have to do anything in Photoshop and it's already the way you like it. But if you're shooting in RAW, picture control makes no difference at all. But if you're shooting in JPEG, you can do things like add a lot of vibrance or change the balance of the colors. This histogram is a really useful thing, and what the histogram does is it lets you figure out the exact right exposure. And so the histogram is a graph, and it's a graph of the brightnesses across the, so a graph of all the brightnesses. So here's all your dark stuff and all the bright stuff, but you want the histogram to be mostly in the middle. And so I usually turn on the red, green, blue histogram. The really important thing to notice here is that none of these are touching the right-hand side. Because if they are touching the right-hand side, then your image is overexposed and you're losing that data. But if it's scrunched up to the left, then your image is way too dark, and you can brighten it later, but that will add digital noise. And so I have the least noisy image where you're keeping all of your dark colors and all of your bright colors. If you can have the histogram kind of in the middle. And then you can also zoom in and see how the histogram changes in the different parts of your image. So what I'll do is take a test shot. When I first see the mushroom, I'll like set up the lights and everything, and then take a test shot, and then zoom in on my camera to the brightest part of that image. And make sure that when I zoom over to that brightest part of the image, we're not touching the right-hand side here, because the brightest part of the image often is the most important part of the image, and that's the part that's going to blow out first. And so if these are touching the right-hand side, then you just have to make your exposure dimmer and just keep taking pictures until it looks more like this. Here's one where it is totally blown out, so you can see all of the color channels were touching the right-hand side, and that means all of these white colors, you're just losing all of the detail and all of the color in anything that's kind of bright. And here's a focus stack shot. I like focus stacking a lot because we're combining a whole lot of images. In this one, I combined like 120 images. And that way you can see that the stem, even the part that's closest to the lens, is very sharp. And then the whole mushroom is very sharp. The background is very blurry, so it stands out really well. And there's a lot of different ways to achieve this effect. With this Olympus OM1 has a cool feature that's in-camera focus stacking. And recently I've just been leaving that on. And what it does is it takes 15 pictures and it changes the focus just a little bit each time it takes those pictures. So it takes 15 pictures in like a quarter second. And then it combines all of those into one picture, and it does that all automatically inside the camera. So there's no computer work at the end of the day. And I can get pretty good results with that. But also sometimes if it's like a really tiny mushroom, I'll combine like up to 150 images. Like for really tiny mycenas, combine a whole lot of them. And for that, then I have to use the computer to do that. But a lot of cameras don't have this in-camera focus stacking. So like on my Nikon, I use a feature called focus shift shooting. And I just tell it like take 60 pictures, and that's what it does. And each picture, it changes the focus a little bit. On Canon, they call that focus bracketing. Most other manufacturers call it focus bracketing, but it just takes a whole lot of pictures and changes the focus. But if you have an older camera, then they won't have that feature. But you know, these older cameras still work really well. There have not been a lot of advancements in camera technology in the past 15 years. So if you find like a $100 DSLR at a garage sale, it'll take pictures that are almost every bit as good as the really expensive $5,000 camera. It's just that the screen isn't quite as nice and it doesn't have some of the newer features, and maybe at high ISO you might get a little bit more noise depending on the model. But you can still do stuff like focus stacking even with a really inexpensive camera. And there's two ways to do it. One way is take a picture, move the camera a little closer, take a picture again, move the camera a little closer. Or you take a picture and then change the focus, and then take another picture and change the focus. Either way, you're taking a stack of images that you can combine later. And then another thing that's always fun to photograph is mushrooms that glow in the dark. And so this is one that I took at 3 in the morning in Maryland. And so this is Omphallotus. It's a jack-o'-lantern, and you can see that it's making its own light. So these mushrooms glow in the dark. They glow all day and all night, always this nice green color. But capturing these can be a challenge. So what I will do is set up my tripod and then I'll put on automatic focus, or there's manual focus, but I'll turn on a whole bunch of really bright lights and I'll focus the camera when I have all the really bright lights on, and then I'll switch back to manual focus. So then it's always focused on the camera. And then I will take a picture for like 30 seconds at really high ISO, like 100,000. And when you take a picture super high ISO, the sensor is ridiculously sensitive, but the picture is not going to turn out very well because the ISO, it's just like turning up the gain on a microphone way too much. The audio quality just is not good. But that picture will let me know if I have everything in focus and how bright and how long of a exposure I need. So then usually I'll turn the ISO back down to something reasonable, like 800, and then leave the shutter open for something like 3 or 5 minutes. And that way, that's the picture that I actually use. And it also is kind of cool to add like a little bit of light at the same time. So I like to take them in complete blackness and then with a lot of light, but also just a tiny bit of light so you can see the mushroom. You can see the mushrooms glowing, but you can also see like the rest of the mushroom in the same shot. So also, once you've taken a whole lot of pictures, if you just have millions of photos on your hard drive, you're never going to be able to find them. So I like to make one directory for each day, and then I'll put the date there on the left. So you can sort these numerically, sorts them by date, then it's the location over on the right. And if you don't back up your data, then you don't really own it. You're just one fire or flood or dropped hard drive away from losing all of your data. So I like this service called Backblaze. It's like $7 a month, and it just automatically backs up all of your files. And this one is really good for photographers because they don't charge you by the terabyte, they just charge you by the computer. So if you have like 20 hard drives full of photos, you can plug them all in. As long as you plug them all in once a month or so, it doesn't cost any more to back up all of that data. And it's also kind of cool because if I'm traveling and I need something that's on a hard drive I didn't bring, I can just log in and download like a presentation or something. And I don't have to carry all those hard drives with me. Another really important thing is to format your memory cards pretty often. A lot of people will leave their photos on their memory cards for months or years, and you really can't trust memory cards. They fail a lot, especially if you don't format them very often. So what I'll do is at the end of every day, I copy all of the files onto my computer, and then I'll check to make sure that it finished and it did copy all those files, and then I will format the memory card in the camera. And formatting the memory card in the camera makes sure that it's in a good format, in a good state, and it makes it much less likely that you'll lose data. And if you do, you'll be losing a lot less because it'll be only 1 day's worth of stuff on the memory card instead of weeks or months worth of stuff in that memory card. And then once you get a really awesome mushroom photo, your next question is going to be, well, what did I photograph? So every time you photograph a mushroom, you should save a dried sample of that mushroom. You don't have to save a lot. Like if you save just 1 gill from every mushroom you photograph, that's infinite times better than saving nothing, because just 1 gill is plenty for doing DNA sequencing and also microscope work. Usually if I think it's like a new species and a really cool thing, I'll save a whole collection, some younger ones, some older ones, everything in between, and I'll also make a spore print on glass, like microscope slide. And this DNA sequencing has revolutionized our understanding of mushrooms. And if you have a really awesome photo of a mushroom, if you can get a DNA sequence, then that awesome photo becomes so much more valuable, because then you have a DNA sequence to tie this mushroom to a species, and you can tell if it's a new species, or you can tell exactly what it is. There's a couple places. There's mycologist or the mushroom DNA lab, and both of these places, you can mail them lots of dried mushrooms, and they will sequence them all. Recently, I took 2,700 bags of mushrooms from my house and mailed them to my Coda lab for DNA sequencing. And, kind of much in DNA lab will do it for free, but they're way backed up because they're really popular. My Coda lab occasionally does them for free, but you get your data back in a couple months. And then when I collect mushrooms, I put them in a tackle box. It's really good to have them in a tackle box because it keeps them from getting crushed in your backpack, and also just keeps everything separate. And then I dry the mushrooms. If the mushrooms are very dry, they last a very long time. So here, there's hot air that comes out from the back of my laptop. If I just leave mushrooms overnight behind my laptop, they're dry in the morning. It's a kind of small mushroom. If it's like a big oily or something, I gotta slice it thin. Usually I'll just throw the mushrooms up on the dashboard. And if you throw the mushrooms up on the dashboard, drive around for a couple days, they do dry really well. And then once they are completely dry, I'll throw them in a Ziploc bag, put a desiccant, silica gel desiccant pack in there, and label them with iNaturalist observation number. But really big mushrooms are pretty easy to keep separate. If it's a really small mushroom, then I'll put them in these little paper bags. And that way they don't get all mixed around. You can write the iNaturalist number on the paper bag, and that way, they stay separate and they still dry really well, just driving around in those paper bags. You can also use collection numbers. And the idea with this is that when you take a picture of the mushroom in the field, you take a picture of the unique number, and then when you put the mushroom on the dehydrator, you put that number right by your collection. That way you have, you always know which photos go with which dried mushrooms. And for tiny mushrooms, we put them in a bottle cap, because these things would just fly around or fall through the slats in the dehydrator. So if you put them in a bottle cap, then even very tiny mushrooms will still be there in the morning. And then once I'm done with all of my photography, I upload them to a bunch of places. And the first place I put them all is Mushroom Observer. So that's mushroomobserver.org. And that's a citizen science website where you upload your mushroom photos there, and then everybody votes on what kind of mushroom you have. The really cool thing about Mushroom Observer is that they save your photos forever, even the very large originals. So if you have like a really high quality, high resolution image, and you upload it to Mushroom Observer, even 10 years later, you can download that 100% high quality image. And it, even if your hard drive got lost or all your photos are gone, you still have that really high quality image. iNaturalist is also really good. iNaturalist is both an app and a website. But iNaturalist is huge. It's not just mushrooms, it's birds and plants and trees and everything else in nature. So they have to compress the images, and they lower the image quality down to about 2,000 pixels. If you're just using a cell phone, then that's fine. It doesn't really matter. But if you're taking a lot of care to make sure you have really high quality images, then you lose a lot of detail. But it's really best to put them on Mushroom Observer and iNaturalist, because these sites, they keep a permanent record, but no site lasts forever. We don't know in 50 years which site will still be there. Maybe it's Mushroom Observer, maybe it's iNaturalist. Probably both, because they both have long-term plans, but it's best to have them in both places. And then I really like to upload the photos to Wikipedia. Wikipedia will save your high-resolution image forever. But the cool and the uncool thing about Wikipedia is you have to put it there as a free license. That means anybody can use your photo for anything forever. So that means that they can take your images and they can sell them. They can sell them in an art gallery, they can put them on the news, they can sell t-shirts with your photos on that. In fact, I've been walking through Target and seen t-shirts in Target that had big pictures that I took because I put them up on Wikipedia. So it's like a really nice thing to do for humanity, just to make your work freely available for everybody. And a lot of people see these images. If you put a good picture on Wikipedia, millions of people will see it. And it'll end up in textbooks. You'll be reading the newspaper and see your photography in the newspaper, because reporters know that that's like a place they can go for free images. Yep.
Yeah, question. For the Wikipedia upload, how does it work? I mean, you upload just, I don't know, like supposed to have a thing. Have, let's say, Steve, let's say, philosophy, and then you upload it, or you just upload one in?
So what I do is I go to this website called Wikimedia Commons. So it's not Wikipedia, it's Wikimedia, because there's all these different wiki projects, and the Wikimedia Commons place to store the media, and that can be used in all the different wiki projects like Wikipedia, Wiktionary, all the other projects. So I go over to Wikimedia Commons, upload my photos there, and I tell them what it is, and I upload the highest resolution one, and then I also upload, I paste in the description, I put a link to the iNaturalist and to the Mushroom Observer. So, if somebody comes along and they're like thinking like, I wonder if this is identified correctly, or they want to know more about it, or maybe they noticed that I made a mistake and that it actually has a different name, they can go to iNaturalist and Mushroom Observer, comment on the observation over there, or maybe see the DNA sequence, see the microscopy that I did, everything that's known about that observation. It's really nice to have that link in there. And then I also like to put GPS coordinates of it in there so people know exactly where it was found. Although if it's like, find like 100 pounds of psilocybin mushrooms, then I'll just like put the county. But if it's not something like that, or if it's someone's secret morel spot, I'll just put the county. But if it's like just a few psilocybin mushrooms or a morel spot that I found myself, I'll put the exact GPS coordinates up there. And they store the high resolution forever, so that's a good place to put images. And then Instagram is nice, just because a really good mushroom photo can get a lot of people into mushrooms. And if people see like a really colorful, beautiful photo of a cool mushroom, they're gonna maybe like want to be able to go take pictures like that themselves, or it'll encourage them to go outside and start studying nature. And the more people we can encourage in studying nature, the more people we have that care about if they just cut down all the forests. For example, just last week, Donald Trump signed an executive order saying that they should just cut down almost 300 million acres of forest. Now, we only have 100 million acres of national forest. So that includes a lot of BLM land and that stuff too. We need people that pick mushrooms that care and be like, no, you shouldn't approve these permits. You should really think twice about this. Because if people don't pick mushrooms and they don't care about nature, no one's really going to notice or care if they clear cut all of this forest, and we'll lose all of this biodiversity permanently and all of that sort of thing. So the more people you can get into nature, the more people that will care if about preserving it. So that's one reason to take a good mushroom picture. Facebook is also a good place to upload mushroom pictures, mostly for the Facebook groups. So there's a Facebook group called Rusula. Rusula is where all of the world experts on Rusula all kind of hang out, and so you can like get their attention. Or there's a Cortinarius Facebook group, and so the Cortinarius experts all go there. Or there's this mushroom identification groups that have like 300,000 people in the group. So if you post it in a big mushroom identification group, to get answers really quick. If you get a wrong answer, they will be corrected very quickly. And so Facebook, I think, is the best website just for discussing mushrooms. And then the last two, Bay Photo, Outbeat Studios, these are websites where you upload your photos and then they send you a physical printout of it. So these here were printed on metal. So it's a sheet of aluminum that's pretty thick, and they look really good. Something like this costs about $40. Something larger like banks, more like $80. But they're really worthwhile. If you get these printed on paper and then get them professionally framed, they'll be like 2 or 3 times the price that it costs just to get them on metal in the first place. And so I like the metal prints, but these places, Bay Photo and Outbeat Studios, they both do metal, they do paper, we're printed on canvas, on plastic. And so, it's in this really high resolution, really good work. So it's a really nice way to get your photos in a permanent format. Thank you very much. And probably got some time for questions if anybody wants to discuss photography. Yep.
See it after the guy.
What's that?
So there's much of that blast and blow through the door.
Yes.
And you see it at night. You go out. Yeah, so jack-o'-lanterns glow in the dark. The jack-o'-lantern that you have here in Georgia is called Ocomotus sardoidus. And yes, they're glowing all day and all night.